It almost feels unfair to your opponents, but if you know this line, you can checkmate black in Sicilian Defense in just 10 moves. I've been playing this variation myself for years, and it worked really well, all the way up to the level of Masters and GMs. Then I had to switch to more classical lines, but prior to that, it worked wonders. Now, the Sicilian Defense starts off with you play pawn e4, and your opponent responds with pawn to c5. And the more you advance in chess, the more often you're going to face the Sicilian Defense. And what I recommend here is that you go for the Alpine variation pawn to c3. It is very easy to learn, unlike the main lines where there's just a ton of theory, plus it's really tricky, which you're going to see in a moment. Now, what's the purpose of this move pawn to c3? Well, it's pretty simple. It's just to play pawn d4 on the next move and to grab the center. The advantage of using this line is that amateurs usually play standard moves which are just wrong against the Alpine, and so they go down really badly. The most common move of black here is knight to c6, which feels natural, but it's already wrong. You'll see why in a moment. If they play any other moves, like indifferent moves such as pawn d6 or whatever, you just play pawn to d4, you grab the center, you achieve your goal, and you already have a nice position with some positional advantage. Now let's go back to the main line where they opt for knight to c6. Now play pawn to d4, grabbing the center. They usually trade on d4, you recapture, and that's the purpose of having this pawn on c3, so that you can recapture and maintain your beautiful pawn center. Now, first of all, you have the space advantage, you have ease of development, you can easily bring all your pieces out here the way you want, thanks to this beautiful center, but there is also an immediate threat. You're threatening to push d5 and chase away this knight, possibly forcing black to undevelop it, moving it back to b8, which black does not want. So what can they do? In most cases, they're going to play pawn to d5, trying to mechanically block your pawn from moving forward. Then what I recommend is a tricky move. Instead of taking on d5, which everyone does, you're going to play knight c3, maintaining the pressure. You keep up adding more and more pressure to this pawn, and your opponent thinks, okay, let's trade. He takes on e4, expecting you to recapture, but instead, you keep pushing forward, keep attacking, and you go pawn to d5, nevertheless attacking this knight on c6. Strangely enough, there are lots of opportunities for black to lose this position within a couple of moves. One of them is trying to move forward, going knight to b4. In this case, you can jump out with your queen a4 with a double attack to the king and knight, therefore winning the knight on the next move, and that's how you achieve a winning position very quickly. Let's take it back. Of course, black could theoretically undevelop their knight, just putting all their pieces back, kind of like they're preparing to resign and already are ready to start the new game. But of course, it's not what they really would wish to have ideally. So most of your opponents will go knight e5, which seems meaningful, putting the knight in the center of the board. Now, here you could take your pawn back, but it's even stronger to do that with a tempo while attacking your opponent at every turn. You can achieve that by going queen a4, check to the king. Now they get a cover, so they play bishop d7. Now your queen captures this pawn on e4, not only regaining the material balance, but also attacking this knight on e5 and forcing black to keep horsing around with it. So they go back knight to g6. And here, of course, you could just develop, and your position is actually great. Thanks to this pawn, black is having a hard time developing their position normally. But there is a tricky move which I like, especially in Blitz. It works really well, but even in all the board games. It's the move knight to b5. At first, it may be hard to understand what is like the purpose of this move. And let's see what most of your opponents will be playing here. Let me enjoy this moment for a second, and I'll show you that you're indeed highly likely to achieve the very same position in your practical games. So here's the database of games, and here in the corner you can see the stats. You see the top move by black by far is knight to c6, which is wrong. Nice for you. You play d4, pretty much everyone, 83%. Captures on d4, you recapture. Again, majority goes d5, some play e6, we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's focus on d5. Now play knight c3, again, everyone captures. Here we go, pawn d5, we're still following along the main line, queen a4, bishop d7, queen a4, knight to g6, that's the position we're talking about. Now you go knight to b5, and as you can see, the top move of black is knight to f6. And after they played, all of a sudden you checkmate them by going knight to d6. Very sneaky checkmate achieved in just 10 moves. Now the point is this pawn is pinned down to the king and therefore it can't move, and so you achieve this really beautiful smothered checkmate. Now the second most common move by black, as you can see right here, instead of knight to f6, is the move queen to a5, trying to counterattack you, but that fails badly just as well. After your opponent has played queen to a5, he hopes that he's putting pressure, attacking your king, and he hopes for your knight to go back, and then black feels safe. But you don't need to do that because you can keep attacking, and so you play bishop d2, covering your king, and attacking the queen. Now the queen still has to guard all these squares where your knight can possibly jump to, whether it's c7 or d6, in both cases it attacks the king, so they play queen b6. And ideally you'd love to play here, and deliver a fork to the king and the rook, or maybe to play here, again using that pin on the and attacking the king, attacking this pawn, but currently this queen guards both of these squares. So all you gotta do is just to push it away. And you do that by playing bishop e3 and say, hey, dude, you gotta go. And if it goes to a5, you then play b4, and now there are no squares available for the queen to maintain the control of these squares. So he'll have to move the queen away somewhere, and as he moves it, then your knight can land to one of these squares and finish the game off. For example, if they go queen to d8, that still comes back to our favorites mother checkmate. What else can your opponent try to do to defend his position? Bishop takes b5 is not an option, although it may seem like the easiest way to get rid of this annoying knight. As you recapture, black suddenly realizes that there is no way to cover the king other than sacrificing the queen, which obviously will lose the game quickly. So that's not an option. Let's take it back. What else can your opponent try here? The correct move by black is pawn to e6, which is counterintuitive, and not many of your opponents will ever find this move. But even after that, you can play d6, shutting down the position, and it's still pretty difficult for black to find the right weight here, because you're threatening knight to c7, which nearly checkmates the king, by the way. Plus, you're threatening queen takes b7, which would grab the pawn and strengthen the threat of knight to c7. And like, again, it's really not easy for black to find the way out. Plus, your position is still good. Like, in the very least, you'll get an equality, or if black can find a way to stop this thing from coming, then you just win within a couple moves. There's another cool variation here that's worth knowing. After you go for the Alpine variation, they play knight c6, the main move of the Sicilian defense, which is incorrect in this case. You go d4, grab in the center, they trade, now they threaten d5. They want to block it, as we know we don't take. We increase the pressure by going knight to c3. Now, as we discussed, if he takes here, that allows your pawn to be pushed forward, and that's already quite annoying by black. As we saw, there are lots of different cool ways for black to lose the game quickly. Now, what if instead of taking on e4, your opponent decides to just guard this pawn by playing pawn to e6? Well, then you can still grab space advantage by going pawn to e5. It's quite handy to have your pawn here, because it takes away this f6 square, and so the knight cannot be developed there any longer. That's why usually your opponent will play bishop b4 first, developing the bishop, you also just develop, and then he develops the knight to the available square, you play bishop d3, and in this position the most common move of black, the natural castling, actually fails to a common tactics known as the Greek gift sacrifice. You sacrifice your bishop over here and win the game within a couple moves. The king has to move forward. Now knight to g5 delivers yet another check to the king, and moreover it opens up this route for your queen to be involved into the attack. So if the king moves back, you're going queen h5, and on the next move you checkmate black by going queen to h7. So that's what you do if your opponent moves his king back. That's like the classical variation of these tactics. Now let's take it back. Your opponent can never really move the king forward to h6. It is deadly exposed here, plus there is this bishop which x-rays the king, which enables all kinds of discovered checks and attacks here. Your knight can jump to f7 or to e6, which would open up this check to the king, and after that your knight will happily grab the queen. Therefore, moving the king to h6 is not an option as well. Finally, they may try king to g6. Of course, the king is bravely moving forward, it's very much exposed, you can attack it differently. The easiest way is to actually push the pawn forward, playing h4, getting ready to play h5 on the next move, and black is defenseless. After black plays whatever move, doesn't matter, you push the pawn forward, all these squares are taken away, therefore the king cannot go there. The only square available is king to h6, but then it goes right into our discover check thing. So knight takes e6 would open up this check, then you grab the queen and you continue attacking his king, so you completely demolish black. Alrighty, that covers pawn to d5. As you know, you're gonna play knight to c3, putting a lot of pressure on black, and you win in all the main lines here. Let's take it back. What if black tries pawn e6, which is the second most played move here by black? Well, although it controls the d5 square, it actually doesn't stop you from moving there, and you should, and you drive away the knight. Now, after this exchange, at first sight, it looks like the position is just normal, about equal, but again, there are so many opportunities for black to go wrong and to get in a losing position quickly. One of them is to move this knight to e7. Then you play pawn d6, gaining a tempo, and this pawn on d6 is really a monstrous pawn that just shuts down black's position. Pawn can go forward, bishop can be developed, therefore the rook can join the game, the queen is limited, the king is limited, like this bishop can't go out. This little pawn is just really oppressing black's position so much. And moreover, after the knight moves, you can win the game right away after playing queen e2, delivering this check to the king, and the only way for them to cover would be to give up some material. For example, bishop e7, and then you can just take it and you're up a piece. Plus, you're not even in a hurry. The bishop is pinned down to the king, so black can't do anything. You can even just develop knight f3, knight c3, and then at some point grab this bishop when you feel comfortable doing so. So that's one way for black to get in a losing position quickly. If your opponent decides to undevelop the knight and go back to b8, well, first of all, it's quite sad for black. Secondly, you can still press black by going pawn to d6. That's what I'd recommend you to do. With all the advantages we talked about before, black can't develop normally, plus you still have the same threat of queen e2 going after the king, which is not easy to stop by black. There is a slight disadvantage that this pawn is far away from the rest of your army, and black can possibly try to capture it one way or the other, but even if they succeed in doing so, they'll have to spend several moves just to get your pawn, and they'll fall behind in development. During this time, you'll just develop quickly and rush into the attack. So I would say that in a real practical game, especially in blitz, this is almost deadly for black. Alright, so how about the move which seems to be the most logical, knight to e5, putting the knight to the middle of the board? Well, since we aim to be the most evil guy in the room, we're gonna play queen e2, pinning the knight down to the king and attacking it. Most of your opponents will defend it naturally by going pawn to d6, which fails to pawn f4, and now the knight cannot run away because it's pinned down to the king, and then you win the knight on the next move, and you also set it up for various kinds of checks as well. So that's how you win here. Finally, what's the correct way for black? Well, let's take this move back. Instead of pawn to d6, which is the most played move by black, and that's how most of your opponents will actually lose their games against you, they gotta play queen e7, neutralizing the pin so that they interpose their own queen in front of, the king, so that the knight is no longer pinned. Well, in this case, you just continue developing. What I recommend is you just play bishop e3. Now the e-file is no longer useful for you, so you can block it. And then after they develop one way or the other, you just develop naturally. You can always castle queenside if you want to. It's completely fine for white. Or if they just do what they usually do, something like this, I mean, you even have this unpleasant discover check. I'm just showing you the variations just for reference. You don't have to really memorize them here. It's easy for white to develop, and so you play casual moves, just developing and castling. And as you do so, very often your opponent will find himself in trouble, because as soon as you put the rook to the open e-file, you see that all their heavy pieces will be in big danger. And again, it's really easy for black to go around it here and to lose the game quickly. In fact, this position is probably already lost for black. And here's a little challenge for you. I mentioned that in this position, I recommend that you play bishop e3. But why not put in this bishop to a more active square, bishop f4, and attacking this knight? Currently, it is black to play, so let me flip the board. Now it's black to move, and if you can find the right move for black here,